A veteran counted the money for loaves of bread. What Dean Martin did next shocked the whole shop and proved that true generosity isn't about the size of the gesture, but about preserving someone's dignity while changing their life forever. It was Saturday morning, March 18, 1967, and Dean Martin was doing something that most celebrities never did: grocery shopping for himself at Romano's Market, a small Italian-American grocery store in North Hollywood that reminded him of the neighborhood shops from his childhood in Steubenville, Ohio. The store was cramped but authentic, with narrow aisles lined floor to ceiling with imported olive oil, homemade pasta, fresh bread baked daily, and the kind of personal service that was disappearing from most of America but survived in places like this. Dean had discovered Romano's 2 years earlier when he'd been looking for the specific type of prosciutto that his mother used to serve. And he'd become a regular customer despite the fact that he could afford to have someone else handle his shopping. There was something grounding about the simple act of choosing his own groceries, something that connected him to the person he'd been before fame had insulated him from ordinary experiences. The store was owned by Giuseppe Romano, a 70-year-old immigrant from Sicily, who had built his business through 6 decades of 16-hour days and treating every customer like family. Giuseppe's English was heavily accented, but perfectly clear, and his memory for his customers' preferences was legendary. He knew that Dean liked his bread day-old because it reminded him of his grandmother's cooking, that he preferred San Marzano tomatoes for his Sunday sauce, and that he always bought extra cannoli when his daughter was visiting. This particular Saturday morning, Dean was shopping for ingredients for a dinner he was planning to cook for friends that evening. He'd already selected olive oil, garlic, fresh basil, and Romano cheese, and was heading toward the bread counter when he noticed the man standing ahead of him in line. The customer was probably in his mid-40s, though he looked older, worn down by experiences that had aged him beyond his years. He was thin in the way that suggested not enough regular meals rather than natural build, and his clothes were clean but clearly old, carefully maintained garments that had been mended multiple times. Most notably, he wore a faded army jacket with Korean War service patches, the kind of jacket that veterans kept not for warmth, but for the memories and identity it carried. His name was Robert Bobby Chen. Their Dean didn't know that yet. Bobby had served as a combat medic with the 2nd Infantry Division during some of the heaviest fighting of the Korean War, had been wounded twice and decorated for courage under fire, and had returned home to discover that the country he'd served wasn't particularly interested in helping him readjust to civilian life. Bobby had struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in 1967 it was simply called war nerves and was something that men were expected to handle quietly and without complaint. He'd had difficulty holding jobs, not because he wasn't capable or willing to work, but because loud noises made him jump, crowds made him nervous, and supervisors who had never been in combat didn't understand why someone would need to step outside when a truck backfired in the loading dock. For the past 3 years, Bobby had been living in a small studio apartment above a hardware store, surviving on his modest disability pension and occasional work as a night security guard. He was proud, dignified, and determined to maintain his independence despite the financial challenges that made every grocery trip an exercise in careful budgeting. This morning, Bobby was standing at Romano's bread counter with 4 loaves of day-old bread in his basket and a small collection of coins and crumpled dollar bills in his hand. He was counting the money carefully, checking and rechecking to make sure he had enough for his purchase, while trying to be as inconspicuous as possible about his financial situation. Dean watched from behind Bobby in line and immediately understood what was happening. He recognized the careful counting, the quiet anxiety, the way Bobby was calculating whether he could afford all 4 loaves or whether he'd need to put one back. Dean had seen his own father do the same thing during the Depression, had watched other men make the same calculations when money was tight, and dignity was the only thing that couldn't be compromised. Giuseppe Romano was working the counter that morning, and Dean could see that the old man had also recognized Bobby's situation. Giuseppe's expression was kind, but concerned, the look of someone who wanted to help, but understood that some kinds of help could be more hurtful than helpful if not offered in the right way. 4 loaves, day old, Giuseppe said gently. That'll be $3.20. Bobby counted his money again, and Dean could see the disappointment cross his face as he realized he was about 40 cents short. It was the kind of small deficit that represented the difference between a week of adequate meals and a week of making do with less. But it was also the kind of problem that couldn't be solved without potentially embarrassing someone who was already struggling to maintain his dignity. Actually, Bobby said quietly, I think I'll just take 3 loaves today. Dean stepped forward before Giuseppe could respond. Excuse me, Dean said, his voice carrying the warmth that had made millions of people feel like his personal friend. I couldn't help but notice that you're a Korean War veteran. Bobby turned around, surprised by the interruption, and his expression shifted to recognition as he saw one of the most famous faces in America standing behind him in line. Yes, sir, Bobby replied, unsure where this conversation was heading, but maintaining the respectful demeanor that had been trained into him during his military service. I want to thank you for your service, Dean said, and there was nothing performative about the statement. My brother was in Korea too, and I know what you guys went through over there. Bobby nodded, accepting the thanks with the quiet grace that characterized most veterans of his generation. I was wondering, Dean continued, if you'd let me buy your groceries today, not as charity, but as one American thanking another for serving our country. The request was phrased carefully, designed to offer help while preserving Bobby's dignity and avoiding any suggestion that he was an object of pity rather than respect. Bobby's first instinct was to decline, to maintain his independence and avoid accepting what might feel like charity. But something in Dean's tone and demeanor suggested that the offer was genuine, respectful, and based on recognition of his military service rather than his current financial situation. That's very kind of you, Mr. Martin, but I don't want to impose. You're not imposing, Dean replied firmly. You served your country when it needed you. Now your country, in the form of someone who was lucky enough not to have to go to war, wants to serve you. That's not charity, that's just how it should work. Giuseppe Romano had been listening to the exchange with growing approval, recognizing in Dean's approach the kind of thoughtful generosity that honored both the giver and the receiver. Tell you what, Dean said to Giuseppe, let's get Bobby here all 4 loaves, and anything else he needs. Put it all on my account. Bobby started to protest again, but Dean held up his hand. Bobby, can I ask you something? When you were in Korea, if one of your buddies was wounded and needed help, would you have helped him? Of course, Bobby replied without hesitation. And would you have wanted him to feel bad about needing help, or would you have been glad you could do something for someone who had your back? Bobby understood the comparison immediately. I would have been glad to help. Well, you had my back too, Dean said. You and every other guy who served over there. You protected all of us who stayed home, and now it's my turn to have your back. Dean turned to Giuseppe. Giuseppe, I want you to set up an account for Bobby here. Every week, he comes in and gets whatever groceries he needs, and you put it on my tab. And Giuseppe, I want you to treat him like the hero he is, because that's what he is. Giuseppe nodded enthusiastically. Of course, Mr. Martin, it would be my honor. But Dean wasn't finished. Bobby, I'm also wondering if you might be interested in some part-time work. I've got properties that need security, and I'd rather hire someone I trust, someone with your background and experience, than go through some agency. Bobby's expression showed a mixture of gratitude and relief. Work meant dignity, independence, the ability to earn his way rather than simply receiving help. What kind of work are you talking about? Bobby asked. security for my recording studio, maybe some work at my house when I'm traveling. Nothing too demanding, but steady hours and good pay. You interested?" Bobby straightened up, and for the first time since Dean had been watching him, he looked like the soldier he had been, rather than the struggling veteran he had become. "Yes, sir. I'm very interested." Dean extended his hand to Bobby, and the handshake they shared was firm, respectful, between equals rather than between benefactor and beneficiary. "Good. Giuseppe, you've got my number. Have Bobby call me Monday morning and we'll work out the details." As Dean paid for both his groceries and Bobby's, he noticed that other customers in the store had been watching the interaction with obvious approval. An older woman near the produce section had tears in her eyes. A young man with his own military-style haircut was nodding with understanding and respect. Giuseppe Romano would later say that the 15 minutes he spent watching Dean Martin turn a moment of potential embarrassment into an opportunity for dignity and hope was one of the most beautiful things he had witnessed in 60 years of serving his community. Bobby Chen worked security for Dean Martin's properties for the next 12 years, eventually becoming head of security for all of Dean's businesses. The steady income and renewed sense of purpose allowed him to rebuild his life, move to a better apartment, and eventually buy a small house in the San Fernando Valley. But more importantly, Bobby later said, Dean's intervention had given him back something that was more valuable than money: his sense of worth as a human being, and his belief that his military service had mattered to someone. "Dean Martin saved my life that day," Bobby would tell people years later, "not just financially, but in every way that matters. He saw me as a hero when I had forgotten that's what I was." Dean never spoke publicly about helping Bobby, never used the story for publicity, never treated it as anything more than the simple act of one American helping another. When reporters occasionally asked him about his charitable activities, Dean would always deflect the questions. "Everyone should help veterans," Dean would say. "These guys earned our respect and our support. It's not charity when you're paying a debt you owe." The story became part of the folklore of Romano's Market, told and retold by Giuseppe and his customers, as an example of how a truly generous person behaves. Not with grand gestures or public announcements, but with quiet recognition of human dignity, and the understanding that everyone deserves a chance to rebuild their life with respect intact. If this story of quiet generosity and recognizing the dignity in every person moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Share this with anyone who needs to know that the most powerful help we can give others preserves their dignity while changing their circumstances. Have you ever been helped by someone who made you feel respected rather than pitied? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible stories about the quiet heroes who change lives through simple acts of human kindness.